Chapter 28, America on the World Stage, 1899 to 1909. Liberty-loving Filipinos assumed that they, like the Cubans, would be granted their freedom after the Spanish-American War. They were tragically deceived. The Senate refused to pass such a resolution granting Filipino independence. Bitterness toward the American troops mounted. It finally erupted into open insurrection on February 4, 1899, under Emilio Aguinaldo. The war with the Philippines, unlike the splendid little set to with Spain, was sordid and prolonged. It involved more savage fighting, more soldiers killed, and far more scandal. Anti-imperialists redoubled their protests. In their view, the United States, having plunged into the war with Spain to free Cuba, was now fighting 10,000 miles away to rivet shackles on a people who asked for nothing but liberty in the American tradition. Little brown brothers in the Philippines. As the ill-equipped Filipino armies were defeated, they melted into the jungle to wage vicious guerrilla warfare. Many of the outgunned Filipinos used barbarous methods, and the infuriated American troops responded in kind. A brutal soldier's song betrayed inner feelings. Damn, damn, damn the Filipinos, cross-eyed Kiak landrones. Underneath the starry flag, civilize them with a crag, and return to our beloved homes. Atrocity tales shocked and rocked the United States, for such methods did not reflect America's better self. Uncle Sam's soldiers resorted to such extremes as the painful water cure, that is, forcing water down victims' throats until they yielded information or died. Reconcentration camps were even established that strongly suggested those of Butcher Wyler in Cuba. America, having begun the Spanish War with noble ideals, now dirtied its hands. One New Yorker newspaper published a reply to Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, "We've taken up the white man's burden of ebony and brown. Now will you kindly tell us, Rudyard, how we may put it down?" The backbone of the Filipino insurrection was finally broken in 1901, when American soldiers cleverly infiltrated a guerrilla camp and captured Aguinaldo. But sporadic fighting dragged along for many dreary months. The problem of a government for the conquered islanders worried President McKinley, who, in 1899, appointed the Philippine Commission to make appropriate recommendations. In its second year, this body was headed by future President William H. Taft, an able and amiable lawyer judge from Ohio who weighed about 350 pounds. Forming a strong attachment to the Filipinos, he called them his little brown brothers and danced light-footedly with their tiny women. But among the American soldiers, sweatily combing the jungles, a different view of the insurgent prevailed. He may be a brother to Big Bill Taft, but he ain't no brother of mine. McKinley's benevolent assimilation of the Philippines proceeded with painful slowness. Millions of American dollars were poured into the islands to improve roads, sanitation, and public health. Important economic ties, including trade and sugar, developed between the two peoples. American teachers, pioneers of the blackboard, set up an unusually good school system and helped make English a second language. But all this vast expenditure, which profited America little, was ill-received. The Filipinos, who hated compulsory Americanization, preferred liberty. Like caged hawks, they beat against their gilded bars until they finally got their freedom on the 4th of July, 1946. In the meantime, thousands of Filipinos emigrated to the United States. Hinging the open door in China. Exciting events had meanwhile been brewing in faraway and enfeebled China. Following its defeat by Japan in 1894-95, the imperialist European powers, notably Russia and Germany, moved in. Like vultures descending upon a wounded whale, they began to tear away valuable leaseholds and economic spheres of influence from the Manchu government. A growing group of Americans viewed the vivisection of China with alarm. Churches worried about their missionary strongholds. Manufacturers and exporters feared that Chinese markets would be monopolized by Europeans. An alarmed American public, openly prodded by the press and slyly nudged by certain free trade Britons, demanded that Washington do something. Secretary of State John Hay, a quiet but witty poet, novelist, diplomat with a flair for capturing the popular imagination, finally decided upon a dramatic move. In the summer of 1899, Hay dispatched to all the great powers a communication soon known as the Open Door Note. He urged them to announce that in their leaseholds or spheres of influence, they would respect certain Chinese rights and the ideal of fair competition. The phrase "open door" quickly caught the public fancy and gained wide acceptance. Hay's proposal caused much squirming in the leading capitals of the world. It was like asking all those who did not have thieving designs to stand up and be counted. Italy alone accepted the open door unconditionally. It was the only major power that had no leasehold or sphere of influence in China. Britain, Germany, France, and Japan all accepted, but subject to condition that others acquiesce unconditionally. Russia, with covetous designs on China's Manchuria, politely declined, but John Hay artfully interpreted the Russian refusal as an acceptance and proclaimed that the open door was in effect. Under such dubious midwifery was the infant born, and no one should have been surprised when the child proved to be sickly and relatively short-lived. Open door or not, patriotic Chinese did not care to be used as a doormat by the Europeans. In 1900, a super-patriotic group known as the Boxers broke loose with the cry, "Kill foreign devils." Over 200 missionaries and other ill-fated whites were murdered, and a number of foreign diplomats were besieged in the capital, Beijing. A multinational rescue force of some 18,000 soldiers, including 2,500 Americans, arrived in the nick of time and quelled the rebellion. Participation in a joint military operation, especially in Asia, was plainly contrary to the nation's time-honored principles of non-entanglement and non-involvement. So I just want to pause for a quick second. This is pretty significant because here we have the U.S. joining an international coalition of forces to crush a foreign uprising in Asia. So this is a kind of a break from our isolationism when we crushed the Boxer Rebellion. The victorious Allied invaders acted angrily and vindictively. They assessed prostrate China an excessive indemnity of $333 million, of which America's share was to be $24.5 million. When Washington discovered that this sum was much more than enough to pay damages and expenses, it remitted about $18 million of it. The Beijing government appreciated this gesture of goodwill, set aside the money to educate a select group of Chinese students in the United States. These bright young scholars later played a significant role in the westernization of Asia. Secretary Hay now let fly another paper broadside, for he feared that the triumphant powers might use the Boxer outrages as a pretext for carving up China outright, making it a colony. His new circular note to the powers in 1900 announced that henceforth the open door would embrace the territorial integrity of China, in addition to its commercial integrity. So quick pause. The first open door note said that everybody should be able to trade with everybody, essentially, that there will be no Chinese rights will be respected, and that we'd have fair competition. Anybody could trade with anybody. So if England's sphere of influence is open to everybody, France's. So that's a commercial integrity, commercial freedom. And the second open door note said that China will not be carved up into colonies by Europe. So two open door notes. Defenseless China was spared partition during these troubled years, but its salvation was probably not due to Hay's fine phrases, but to the strength of the competing powers. None of them could trust the others not to seek their own advantage. Imperialism or Bryan in 1900. President McKinley's renomination by the Republicans in 1900 was a foregone conclusion. He had piloted the country through a victorious war. He had acquired rich, though burdensome, real estate. He had established the gold standard, and he had brought the promised prosperity of the full dinner pail. "We'll stand pat," was the poker-playing counsel of Mark Hanna, since 1897, a senator from Ohio. McKinley was renominated at Philadelphia on a platform that smugly endorsed prosperity, the gold standard, and overseas expansion. An irresistible vice presidential boom had developed for Teddy Roosevelt, TR, the cowboy hero of San Juan Hill. Capitalizing on his war-born popularity, he had been elected governor of New York, where the local political bosses had found him headstrong and difficult to manage. They therefore devised a scheme to kick the colorful colonel upstairs to the vice presidency. They wanted to get rid of him. This plot to railroad Roosevelt worked beautifully. Gesticulating wildly, he attended the nominating convention, where his Western-style cowboy hat had made him stand out like a white crow. He had no desire to die a slow rot in the vice presidential burying ground, but he was eager to prove that he could get the nomination if he wanted it. He finally gave in to it, a chanting chorus of "We want Teddy." He received a unanimous vote, except for his own. A frantic Hannah reportedly moaned that there would be only one heartbeat between that wild-eyed madman, that damned cowboy, and the presidency of the United States. William Jennings Bryan was the odds-on choice for the Democrats, meeting at Kansas City. The free silver issue was now as defunct as the abandoned mine, but Bryan, a slave to consistency, forced a silver plank down the throats of his protesting associates. Choking on its candidate's obstinacy, the Democratic platform proclaimed, as did Bryan, that the paramount issue was Republican overseas imperialism. Campaign history partially repeated itself in 1900. McKinley, the soul of dignity, sat safely on his front porch as before. Bryan, also as before, took to the stump in a cyclone campaign, assailing both imperialism and Republican-fostered trusts. Monopolies, right? The super energetic second fiddle Roosevelt out-Bryaned Bryan. He toured the country with revolver-shooting cowboys, and his popularity cut heavily into Bryan's support in the Midwest. Flashing his magnificent teeth and pounding his fist fiercely into his palm, Roosevelt denounced all dastards who would haul down Old Glory. Bryanites loudly trumpeted their paramount issue of imperialism. Lincoln, they charged, had abolished slavery for 3.5 million Americans. McKinley had reestablished it for 7 million Filipinos. Republicans responded by charging that Bryanism, not imperialism, was the paramount issue. By this accusation, they meant that Bryan would rock the boat of prosperity once he got into office with his free silver lunacy and other dangerous ideas. The voters were much less concerned about imperialism than about 4 more years of a full dinner pail. When the smoke cleared, McKinley had triumphed by a much wider margin than in 1896, 7,218,491 to 6,356,734 popular votes, and 292 to 155 electoral votes. But victory for the Republicans was not a mandate for or against imperialism. Many citizens who favored Bryan's anti-imperialism feared his free silver. Many who favored McKinley's sound money hated his imperialism. One citizen wrote to former President Cleveland, "It is a choice between evils, and I'm going to shut my eyes, hold my nose, vote, go home, and disinfect myself." If there was any mandate at all, it was for 2 Ps, prosperity and protection. Content with good times, the country anticipated 4 more years of full dinner pail crammed with fried chicken. Boss Platt of New York gleefully looked forward to Inauguration Day, when he would see Roosevelt exit Albany and take the veil as vice president. T.R., the brandisher of the big stick. Kindly William McKinley had scarcely served another 6 months when, in September of 1901, he was murdered by a deranged anarchist. Roosevelt became president at age 42, the youngest thus far in American history. Knowing he had a reputation for impulsiveness and radicalism, he sought to reassure the country by proclaiming that he would carry out the policies of his predecessor. Cynics sneered that he would indeed carry them out to the garbage heap. What manner of man was Theodore Roosevelt, the red-blooded blue blood? Born into a wealthy and distinguished New York family, he had fiercely built up his spindly, asthmatic body by a stern and self-imposed routine of exercise. Graduating from Harvard with Phi Beta Kappa honors, he published at the age of 24 the first of some 30 volumes of muscular prose. Then came the busy years, which involved duties as a ranch owner and bespectacled cowboy in the Dakotas, followed by various political posts. When fully developed, he was a barrel-chested 5 feet 10 inches, with prominent teeth, squinty eyes, droopy mustache, and a piercing voice. The Rough Rider's high-voltage energy was electrifying. Believing that it was better to wear out than to rust out, he would shake the hands of some 6,000 people at one stretch, or ride horseback many miles in a day as an example of portly cavalry officers. Not surprisingly, he gathered about him a group of athletic, tennis-playing cronies who were popularly dubbed the Tennis Cabinet. Incurably boyish and bellicose, Roosevelt loved the fight, an elegant row. He never ceased to preach the virile virtues and denounce civilized softness with his pacifists and other flubdubs and mollycoddles. An ardent champion of military and naval preparedness, he adopted as his pet proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far." If statesmen had the big stick, they could work their will among foreign nations without shouting. If they lacked it, shouting would do no good. T.R. had both a big stick and a shrill voice. Wherever Roosevelt went, there was a great stir. At a wedding, he eclipsed the bride. At a funeral, the corpse. Shockingly unconventional, he loved to break hoary precedents. The hoarier, the better. He was a colossal egoist, and his self-confidence merged with self-righteousness. So sure was he of the correctness of his convictions that he impetuously branded people liars who disagreed with him. As a true cosmopolite, he loved people and mingled with those of all ranks, from Catholic cardinals to professional prize fighters, one of whom blinded a Roosevelted eye in a White House bout. An outspoken moralizer and reformer, Roosevelt preached virtue from the White House pulpit. Yet he was an opportunist who would cut a deal rather than butt his head against a stone wall. He was, in reality, much less radical than his blustery actions would indicate. A middle-of-the-roader, he stood just a little to the left of center and bared his mule-like molars at liberals and reactionaries alike. Roosevelt rapidly developed into a master politician with an idolatrous personal following. After visiting him, a journalist wrote, "You go home and wring the personality out of your clothes." T.R., as he was called, had an enormous popular appeal. partly because of the common people saw in him a fiery champion. A magnificent showman, he was always front-page copy. His cowboyism, his bear shooting, his outsized teeth, and his pince-nez glasses were ever the delight of cartoonists. Though a staunch party man, he detested many of the dirty-handed bosses. But he learned, as Cleveland never did, to hold his nose and work with them. Above all, Roosevelt was a direct actionist. He believed that the president should lead, and although he made mistakes, he kept things noisily moving, generally forward. Never a lawyer, he condemned the law and the courts as too slow. He had no real respect for the delicate checks and balances among the three branches of government. Finding the Constitution too rigid, he would on occasion ignore it. Finding Congress too rebellious, he tried a mixture of coercion and compromise on it. The president, he felt, may take any action in the general interest that is not specifically forbidden by laws of the Constitution. As one poet noted, the Constitution rides behind and the big stick rides before, which is the rule of precedent in the reign of Theodore. Colombia blocks the canal. Foreign affairs absorbed much of Roosevelt's bullish energy. Having traveled extensively in Europe, he enjoyed a far more intimate knowledge of the outside world than most of his predecessors. The Spanish-American War had emphasized the need for the long-talked-about canal across the Central American Isthmus, through which only printer's ink had ever flowed. Americans had learned a sobering lesson when the battleship Oregon, stationed on the Pacific coast at the outbreak of the war in 1898, had to steam all the way around South America to join the fleet in Cuban waters. An Isthmian canal would plainly augment the strength of the Navy by increasing its mobility. Such a waterway would also make easier the defense of such recent acquisitions as Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines, while facilitating the operations of the American merchant marine. Initial obstacles in the path of the canal builders were the legal rather than geographical. By the terms of the ancient Clayton-Bulwer Treaty concluded in Britain in 1850, the United States could not secure the exclusive control over such a route. But by 1901, Americans' British cousins were willing to yield ground. Confronting with an unfriendly Europe and bogged down in the South African Boer War, they consented to the Hay-Pontefract Treaty in 1901. It not only gave the United States a free hand to build the canal, but conceded the right to fortify it as well. Legal barriers now removed, the next question was, where should the canal be dug? Many American experts favored the Nicaraguan route, but agents of the old French Canal Company were eager to salvage something from their costly failure at S-shaped Panama. Presented by a young, energetic, and unscrupulous engineer, Philip Bonavaria, the new Panama Canal Company suddenly dropped the price of its holdings from $109 million to the fire sale price of $40 million. After much debate, Congress, in June of 1902, decided on the Panama route. The scene now shifted to Colombia, of which Panama was an unwilling part. A treaty highly favorable to the United States was negotiated between Washington and a Colombian government agent in Bogota. It granted to the United States a lease for a 6-mile-wide zone in perpetuity in exchange for $10 million and an annual payment of $250,000. The Colombian Senate rejected the treaty, putting a higher value on this precious Isthmian strip. Evidence later unearthed indicates that had Washington been willing to pay an additional $15 million, the pact would have been approved. Roosevelt was infuriated by his setback at the hands of what he called those Dagos. Frantically eager to be elected president in his own right in 1904, he was anxious to make the dirt fly to impress the voters. Damn the law, he reportedly called in private. I want the canal built. He assailed the blackmailers of Bogota, who, like armed highwaymen, were blocking the onward march of civilization. He failed to note that the U.S. Senate also rejected the treaties. So a treaty was worked out, but it didn't pass the treaty in Bogota, Colombia, and as it says here, the U.S. Senate didn't approve the treaty either, and before anything can happen, the legislators have to approve it. So what happens? Uncle Sam creates Puppet Panama. Impatient Panamanians, who had rebelled numerous times, were ripe for another revolt. They had counted on a wave of prosperity to follow construction of the canal, and they feared that the United States would now turn to the Nicaraguan route. Scheming Bonavaria was no less disturbed by the prospect of losing the company's $40 million. Working hand in glove with the Panama revolutionists, he raised a tiny quote-unquote patriot army consisting largely of members of the Panamanian Fire Department, plus 500 bought Colombian troops, for a reported price of $100,000. The Panama Revolution occurred on November 3, 1903, with the incidental killing of a Chinese civilian and a donkey. Colombian troops were gathered to crush the uprising, but U.S. naval forces would not let them cross the isthmus. Roosevelt justified this highly questionable interference by a strained interpretation of the Treaty of 1846 with Colombia. This pact obliged Washington to maintain the perfect neutrality of the isthmus, obviously against outsiders. However, at the time they're using it against Colombia. Roosevelt moved rapidly to make steamy Panama a virtual outpost of the United States. 3 days after the uprising, he hastily extended the right hand of recognition. 15 days later, Banau-Varilla, who was now the Panamanian minister despite his French citizenship, signed the Hay-Banau-Varilla Treaty in Washington. The price of this canal strip was left the same, but the zone was widened from 6 to 10 miles. The French company gladly pocketed its $40 million from the United States Treasury. Roosevelt, it seems clear, did not actively plot to tear Panama away from the Columbia side, but the conspirators knew of this angrily expressed views, and they counted on using the big stick to hold Colombia at bay. Yet the Rough Rider became so indiscreetly involved in the Panama affair as to create the impression that he had been a secret party to the intrigue. Unhappily, the United States suffered a black eye as a result of Roosevelt's cowboy diplomacy. European imperialists who were old hands at this sort of thing could now raise their eyebrows in scorn at America's superior moral pretensions, and they did. Completing the canal and appeasing Colombia. The so-called Rape of Panama marked an ugly downward lurch in U.S. relations with Latin America. Much fear had already been aroused by the recent seizure of Puerto Rico and by the Yankee stranglehold on Cuba. The fate of Colombia, when it dared to defy the colossus of the North, indicated that its weak fellow republics were not safe. The era of the bullying Big Brother policy was brazenly launched. Roosevelt heatedly defended himself against all charges of evildoing. He claimed that he had received a mandate from civilization to start the canal and that Colombia had wronged the United States by not permitting itself to be benefited. To deal with these blackmailers, he insisted, was like nailing currant jelly to the wall. But TR was not completely candid. He failed to point out that the Nicaraguan route was about equally feasible and that it was available without a revolution. Yet this alternative would have involved some delay, and the presidential election of 1904 was fast approaching. Active work was begun on making the dirt fly in 1904, but grave difficulties were encountered, ranging from labor troubles to landslides. The organization was finally perfected under the energetic but autocratic West Point engineer Colonel George Washington Goethals. At the outset, sanitation proved to be more important than excavation. Colonel William Gorgas, the quiet and determined exterminator of yellow fever in Havana, ultimately made the canal zone as safe as a health resort. Americans finally succeeded where the French failed. In 1904, the colossal canal project was completed at an initial cost of about $400 million, just as World War I was breaking out. The whole enterprise, in the words of the English writer James Bryce, was the greatest liberty man had ever taken with nature. TR's perversion of the Monroe Doctrine. Latin America's debt defaults created conditions for further Rooseveltian involvement in affairs south of the border. Nations such as Venezuela and the Dominican Republic were chronically in arrears in their payments to European creditors, particularly Britain and Germany. Seeking to force payment, German warships sank 2 Venezuelan gunboats and bombarded a town in early 1903. This iron-fisted intervention aroused Roosevelt. He feared that if the Germans or British got their foot in the door as bill collectors, they might remain in Latin America in flagrant violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Roosevelt therefore devised a devious policy of preventative intervention, better known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He declared that in the event of future financial malfeasance by Latin American nations, the United States itself would intervene, take over the customs houses, pay off the debts, and keep the troublesome powers on the other side of the Atlantic. In short, no outsiders could push around Latin American nations except Uncle Sam, policeman of the Caribbean. This new brandishing of the big stick in the Caribbean became effective in 1905 when the United States took over the management of tariff collections in the Dominican Republic, an arrangement formalized in a treaty with the Dominicans 2 years later. Dominican officials who had raked in much juicy graft were not happy with such interference, and they acquiesced only after some strenuous arm-twisting from Washington. But from a debt-collecting point of view, the Customs House intervention was a success. Roosevelt's corollary, though tacked on to the Monroe Doctrine, bore only a strained relation to the original dictum of 1823. Monroe had, in effect, said to the European powers, "Thou shalt not interfere." TR changed this warning to mean, "We shall intervene to prevent you from intervening." The Roosevelt Doctrine was actually so radical as to be completely new policy, but it gained readier acceptance by being associated with the honored name of Monroe. Yet in its own right, the corollary had considerable merit as a preemptive stroke. Roosevelt's rewriting of Monroe's doctrine had its dark side. It probably did more than any other single step to promote the bad neighbor policy begun in these years. As time wore on, the new corollary was used to justify wholesale interventions and repeated landings of the Marines, all of which helped turn the Caribbean into a Yankee lake. Latin Americans mistakenly cursed the unoffending Monroe when they should have cursed the offending Roosevelt. To them it seemed as though the Monroe Doctrine, far from providing a shield, was a cloak behind which the United States sought to strangle them. The shadow of the big stick likewise fell on Cuba in 1906. Revolutionary disorders brought an appeal from the Cuban president, and necessity being the mother of inventions, U.S. and Marines were landed. These police forces were withdrawn temporarily in 1909, but in Latin America the episode was another example of the creeping power of the Colossus of the North. Roosevelt on the world stage. Booted and spurred, Roosevelt charged into international affairs far beyond Latin America. The outbreak of war between Russia and Japan in 1904 gave him a chance to perform as a global statesman. The Russian bear, having lumbered across Asia, was seeking to bathe its frostbitten paws into the ice-free ports of China's Manchuria, particularly Port Arthur. In Japanese eyes, Manchuria and Korea, in Tsar's hands, were pistols pointed at Japan's strategic heart. Russian troops had invaded Manchuria during the Boxer outburst of 1900, and despite solemn promises, were not withdrawing. The Tsar was obviously stalling until his Trans-Siberian Railroad could be finished, as it would be in a few months. With the clock ticking against them, the Japanese suddenly began war in 1904 with a devastating surprise pounce on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. They proceeded to administer the humiliating series of beatings to the inept Russians, the first serious military setback to a European power by non-European force since the Turkish invasions of the 16th century. But as the war dragged on, Japan began to run short of men and yen, a weakness it did not want to betray to the enemy. Tokyo officials therefore approached Roosevelt in the deepest secrecy and asked him to help sponsor a peace negotiation. Roosevelt agreed and shepherded the delegates of the two sides together at Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1905. The Japanese presented stern demands for a huge indemnity and the entire strategic island of Sakhalin, while the Russians stubbornly refused to admit the depths of their defeat. Blustering at both sides behind the scenes, Roosevelt forced through an accord in which the Japanese received no indemnity for the losses and only the southern half of Sakhalin. For achieving this agreement, as well as for helping arrange an international conference at Algeciras, Spain, in 1906 to mediate North African disputes, Roosevelt received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. But the price of TR's diplomatic glory was high for U.S. foreign relations. Two historic friendships withered on the windswept plains of Manchuria. American relations with Russia, once friendly, soured as the Russians implausibly accused Roosevelt of robbing them of military victory. Revelations about savage massacres of Russian Jews further poisoned American feeling against Russia. Japan, once America's protege, felt robbed at its due compensation. Both newly powerful Japan and America now became rivals in Asia as fear and jealousy between them grew. To many Americans, the Japanese were getting too big for their kimonos. Japanese laborers in California. Adding to the tensions between America and Japan was the issue of Japanese migration to America's Pacific coast. The Japanese government prohibited emigration of its citizens until 1884, when it began allowing temporary laborers to work on sugar plantations in Hawaii. From there, thousands of Japanese were recruited to work in California as farm laborers, railroad workers, and servants. Like the Chinese before them, Japanese immigrants did the nation's most arduous, dangerous work, but were barred from becoming citizens. And like the Chinese, Japanese immigrants confronted racist hostility. Although Japanese residents were never amounted to more than 3% of the state's population, white Californians ranted about the new yellow peril and feared being drowned out in an Asian sea. A showdown on the influx came in 1906 when San Francisco's school board, coping with the aftermath of a frightful earthquake and fire, ordered the segregation of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean students in a special school to free more space for the whites. Instantly, the incident boiled into an international crisis. The people of Japan, who were highly sensitive on the question of race, regarded this discrimination as an insult to them and their beloved children. On both sides of the Pacific, irresponsible war talk sizzled in the yellow press, the real yellow peril. Roosevelt, who as a Rough Rider had relished shooting, was less happy over the prospect that California might stir up a war that all the other states would have to wage. He therefore invited the entire San Francisco Board of Education, headed by a bassoon-playing mayor under the indictment for graft, to come to the White House. TR finally broke the deadlock, but not until he brandished his big stick and bared his big teeth. The Californians were induced to repeal the offensive school order and to accept what became known as the Gentlemen's Agreement. This secret understanding was worked out during 1907 and 1908 by an exchange of diplomatic notes between Washington and Tokyo. The Japanese, for their part, agreed to stop the flow of laborers to the American mainland by withholding passports. Roosevelt worried that his intercession between California and Japan might be interpreted in Tokyo as prompted by fear of the Japanese. Accordingly, he hit upon a dramatic scheme to impress the Japanese with the heft of his big stick. He daringly decided to send the entire battleship fleet on a highly visible voyage around the world. Late in 1907, 16 sparkling white smoke-belched battleships started from Virginia waters. The commander pointedly declared that he was ready for a feast, a frolic, or a fight. The Great White Fleet, saluted by cannonading champagne corks, received tumultuous welcomes in Latin America, Hawaii, New Zealand, and Australia. As events turned out, an overwhelming reception in Japan was the high point of the trip. Tens of thousands of kimonoed schoolchildren had been trained to wave tiny American flags and sing the Star-Spangled Banner, reportedly in English. In the warm diplomatic atmosphere created by the visit of the fleet, the Root Takahira Agreement of 1908 was reached with Japan. The United States and Japan solemnly pledged themselves to respect each other's territorial possessions in the Pacific and to uphold the open door in China. The once fight-thirsty Roosevelt, who thus went out of his way to avoid a war with Japan, regarded the battleship cruise as his most important contribution to peace. The voyage of the White Fleet also gave Uncle Sam a new recruiting slogan: "Join the Navy and see the world."